In this panel, we're focusing on pushing the envelope. What's next? What are some of the new soil health ideas out there? Is it intercropping, growing two crops at once? Is it relay cropping, growing one to harvest and then another one's underneath to harvest that one? And how are we going to push the envelope on soil health and using some of these practices? So hopefully this is the session that gets you thinking out of the box and getting some of those new ideas going. Let's dive right into our panel. We have Marisol, Russ, and Mike with us. And I think it's probably pretty important right now to define some of these terms, right? We have intercropping, we have relay cropping, and Marisol, you're the one that teaches in the classroom, so maybe you could define those terms for us.
Well, yeah, it's important to define them because we hear these terms a lot, right? And intercropping is when you grow two crops together and at the same time during the whole season, and that's called intercropping. Is what Mike was talking about with the pea and the canola and the chickpeas. Relay cropping, where it's a system with camelina and soybean, is a type of intercropping. So within the intercropping, we got some sub definitions. So relay cropping is when two crops grow at the same time, but only part of the cycle of the both crops. So in the case of camelina, you're putting in the fall, then in the spring you flower, and then you interseed that soybean. So that's what we call a relay seeding the soybean, because it's seeded before we harvest the camelina. Then camelina matures, you harvest it, and the soybean continues growing. That's why it's a relay system.
That's good. It's good to have the basics down before we really dive into some of these more complicated topics. And so, you know, I think it's important when you're doing this to set expectations. And Mike, could you tell us a little bit about what your expectations are when you're growing two crops at once?
So when we have more than one crop growing in the field, I think the first thing you have to realize is you're not looking to maximize the yield of either of what you're growing, right? You're looking for more total yield. So a typical example of what we see with some of the systems like the field pea canola is that you're probably not seeding 100% of a seeding rate that you normally would use either. Some you might, but you might not. But the production you're going to get, you maybe would get like 66% of a normal field pea yield and 66% of a normal canola yield. And when you add those together, you might, you're going to get 120 or 130% of total production for what either one of those crops might have produced on its own. And so instead of 60 bushel soybeans, you get like 45 or field peas, sorry. But then you might also have that extra 1,200 pounds of canola to go along with that, for instance. So that's what we call over yielding. So the idea that you can produce more on 1 acre than you could just growing a single crop during that growing season. So we're increasing the efficiency of each acre.
Okay, so you've got two different crops growing at the same time, and you obviously have to make some decisions on fertilizer applications. And how do you decide on that fertilizer plan, Mike, when you're growing those two crops? Do you fertilize for one, do those recommendations but not the other? Or how do you do that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that's going to vary widely based on what people are trying to do with the system. For most intercropping combinations, you're going to have one dominant intercrop in there. Not always. What we're finding with the field pea canola is that on any given season, either one of those two crops can be the dominant driver and be the best producer. But if you look at something like your chickpea flax, you're almost always going to be growing chickpeas and have some flax with it. So chickpeas are your dominant crop, and so you're going to manage it as if it was a chickpea crop, and then you also get some flax on top of that. And so the bottom line is it kind of depends on what you're trying to grow. But I know in the case of the field pea canola, we have seen some benefits when we're intercropping to have some nitrogen addition. With the most successful treatments we have, you don't have that much canola in the mixture, but so you don't have that as high in nitrogen use either. But I think maybe picking some kind of mediary fertility strategy is going to be the best way to go in that case.
Great, thank you for clarifying that. And so Marisol, let's go to you now with, what are your expectations in that corn alfalfa system and having those two crops growing at the same time?
Like Mike says, when you grow two crops together, you have really different objectives because you know that they're not going to produce individually the same. And so in the corn alfalfa system, it really is a system that was developed in a way to establish alfalfa with the corn. So the next year, the alfalfa is already established. And this is because alfalfa in the seeding year is a very low yield. So if we can put them together, then the next year, alfalfa is going to be a full alfalfa crop. But we will lose yield on the corn on the year. And we've lost about, 20%, about 30 bushels out of 180. And people say, oh, no, you're right, I don't want to do that. But if you you have to start thinking on a system approach and take all the years. And when you do that, then the system, it balances itself out. So it loses in one area, but it gains in the other one. Like you gain a lot more yield in the second year in alfalfa, plus all the soil health benefits and pollinators and many other ecosystem services that these cropping systems provide.
And Russ, how about for you? What are your expectations in that relay cropping system with Camelina and soybean?
Yeah, well, both Marisol and Mike hit on a lot of them already. I mean, when we initially got into this, we're looking at, trying to optimize the output, the total yield, if you will, of both crops, not just one, not just the other, but both crops, basically producing three crops in 2 years, right? Or yeah, three crops in 2 years. And, but we're also very concerned with the environmental benefits. And so those ecosystem services are what we're looking at as well. That's why we call these winter oil seeds, winter camelina, and there's some others, or at least another that we're working with. We quote unquote call them cash cover crops because, we're wanting to harvest them to tap into new markets for the growers. And I'll talk maybe a little bit about this because I see there's a question on that here in a little
Perfect.
bit. But also getting those environmental benefits is using it as a cover crop. The one thing you do have to remember about Camelina, we talked about this morning, is it doesn't necessarily put on a lot of growth in the fall, but where it really shines is in the spring, which tends to be when we do have the most nitrogen loss to leaching and runoff and things like that, and other nutrients as well. That's where it really shines because it really takes off growing early and you get good cover. So you get some of those good cover crop benefits as well. But really it's tapping into both the economic and the environmental benefits. Now, the economic benefits are yet a little out there because I saw a question on this. There are not well-established markets for Camelina yet. There are mom and pop markets here and there for uses of the oil, both for industrial purposes and food uses. But there's also now a lot of interest in the seed meal for animal feeds and for the protein. There are we have industrial partners out there that are very interested in the protein. So it's still in its infancy right now, but we're hoping to get those markets developed so they're more robust. It's not corn, soybean, and wheat. You can't just take it down to the co-op and dump it and say, here you go. But there are some companies out there contracting. There's a company up in Canada that's probably further ahead than the United States right now in that Marisol and I have worked with, and they contract for some production. That's mainly the spring camelina up there, but we're moving on that, working with folks.
Can we dive into a little bit more of the environmental benefits of Camelina, Russ? I know you mentioned that it captures some of the nitrate in the spring, but are there other benefits as far as honeybees or other pollinators, benefits from the root structure? Anything else you can add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned bees and pollinators in general, and this is one of the things we have looked at with our research. And the one thing that very interesting with winter camelina is that it begins flowering really early. Like I said, it takes off growing early in the spring. And it starts flowering and develops seed quickly as well, but it begins flowering very early. That tends to be a very critical time for honeybees, domestic bees, which, as probably a lot of people know, a lot of the honeybees, domestic bees in the United States, are housed in the upper Midwest during the summer months. And then, when it starts to get towards winter, they get shipped out to the Gulf Coast and West Coast for pollinating horticultural crops and almond orchards and things like this. But when they're coming back in the spring, early summer, oftentimes there isn't anything much on the landscape flowering other than maybe some dandelions. And now we've gotten so good at taking care of those that you don't even find many of them on the landscape anymore. And that's about the time that Camelina is flowering. And we've seen a lot of honeybee activity on winter Camelina, but we've seen a lot of native pollinators and other insects as well, too, beneficial insects. So that's another one of the big benefits of Camelina.
Great, thank you, Russ. Let's go to Mike and ask him a question on from the Q&A on, have you tried lentil and mustard intercrop? And would you be able to harvest with your header a bit higher than a mono lentil? So I'm glad you're answering this question, because there's no way I know how to answer this one.
I can't say that we've tried that combination. I think lentils would stand to benefit a lot from different types of intercropping, but it certainly would be also its own challenging in its own right. So compared to like what we're doing with our field peas, I think that the lentils aren't going to be as competitive as the field peas would be in that system, and so I think you'd have to wind up with a little bit different seeding ratio to make up for that. I think the mustard could pretty easily overpower what the lentils are going to try to do there, but I could definitely see some harvest ease gains with that type of system. And I see no reason that, after tinkering with some of those seeding rate questions and on a small scale, of course, that you might be able to get that to work out to your benefit. But certainly I can't go into too many specifics because I don't have any direct experience with that one.
So what other combinations are in the pipeline? I mean, you talked about some pretty, tried and true ones that you've been looking at Carrington for a while. Are there other possible combinations that you're looking at?
Yeah, sure. So, one of my goals, prior to this year was to try working with hemp a little bit and trying to figure out some good companions with that, because that's a crop right now where you don't have registered options for weed management, for instance. And so, it's a good candidate to try and figure out some cultural practices to try and supplement that weed management. So, the way last spring went, those plans didn't quite pan out, but coming into this next year, I'm still hoping to go down that road. But the bottom line is that there's a lot of options out there, and the key is to find things that you can plant and harvest at the same time, and especially on the harvesting end, to not only find the species but the specific varieties that can mature, relatively same. You talk about field peas and canola, for instance. Well, it's pretty easy to figure out, well, yeah, we've been able to get that work. But if you picked an early maturing pea and a late maturing canola, that system will fail. All right. You need to be able to synchronize your harvest with whatever species you pick. And so, in that system, finding a late maturing pea and an early maturing canola, it works out a lot better. Now, the good news is that through our statewide NDSU variety testing system, we have data for so many different crops on maturity dates and plant heights and those kind of things that maybe in a traditional cropping system you don't care as much about, but we have that data there. You can go back and look and try to match up some different species, even for that matter, that might be able to, so you can harvest it easier and get them to line up a little better.
Mike, I've got a question here, almost the other side of the coin a little bit. Is there any combination that you thought would work that you just have not had good success with? You've tried and it just hasn't worked.
So I've been working, I guess this is my third year now, so I'm still kind of a newbie in working with these things. We haven't done anything that's flat out failed yet. But we've definitely found with some of the species we've been working with, there are cases where things are going to be nowhere near doable or scalable. But we found other, for instance, seeding rate ratios that really make the system shine. So it all comes down to, I think you can make a lot of things work, but it all comes down to the execution and what you're trying to do. But and then we kind of draw back on some of the previous experiences too. There's been intercropping work done here and there for many years. This is maybe one of the in the last couple of years here. It's been a pretty big area of expansion, I think, in intercropping interest and research. So we'll kind of see how things pan out. But we've been able to look at small scale tests from elsewhere and maybe find some of the things that didn't work as well.
I think it'd be great to go to Marisol now and talk a little bit more about, you work with perennials quite a bit. And so what are some of the benefits of having a perennial in rotation? And is alfalfa into corn, is that the way we start getting perennials back in our rotations here?
I'm glad you asked that because I'm trying to get people to get alfalfa back into rotation. In the past, we had much more diverse rotations that include alfalfa in all Midwest, but with, cash crops and good prices a while back, and then we start going to 2 or 3 crops only, and we lost all the diversity. Perennial crops, especially alfalfa, provides all kinds of benefits to the system. And soil health, if you're really trying to improve soil health, alfalfa is one of the best crops to do that. Not only because it fixes nitrogen, adds nitrogen, but it really increases biological diversity in the soil. We sometimes talk about biodiversity above ground, but the biodiversity below ground is even much more important. Also, alfalfa has very deep tap roots, and the roots can move nutrients from really deep in the soil. They can tap into water, they increase infiltration, they improve aggregates, and the list goes on. It could take a long time. So this system is one system that it might make it easier for people to include rotation in alfalfa in a rotation. The problem is a lot of people don't want to include it because of seed year is very low production. And also other people say, well, yeah, I don't have animals or livestock on my system, so it doesn't work for me. But alfalfa can also be a very profitable cash crop. And so it's very, incorporating with the corn, for those that grow corn, it's an easier way to try to get into the system and try to have at least alfalfa for 2 years.
Great. We're getting another question up that is geared towards you, Marisol. Do you have any advice for farmers in the northwestern North Dakota who would like to incorporate alfalfa into their annual cropping systems?
In drier environments, it's a little harder, right? Because alfalfa is a heavy water user. And so it's harder to get it established. And but I still encourage, and there's people that grow alfalfa. Now, to be successful, many times the alfalfa crop is not successful, not because of the drier environments, because people do not fertilize it, or they don't treat alfalfa like they would another cash crop. And so the first thing I always say, if you want to grow alfalfa, really have a good yield, you need to soil test first. And then provide the nutrients the alfalfa needs. Alfalfa requires phosphorus, requires potassium. It's a good nutrient fixer, but if there's other nutrients that are limiting, it's not going to grow. And so that's very important to keep that in mind. It's a great crop, but you have to treat it as a crop to be able to get the most of alfalfa. And you won't get as much yield as in areas that they rain a lot. Many times on the western part of North Dakota, they get 1 cut or 2 cuts a year at the most, while in the Midwest, they can get 3 and 4. But there still is a crop that's doing a lot of good to the soil. So you can incorporate it, even if it's in a short rotation, a 2-year rotation. I would really encourage farmers to do it.
Thank you, Marisol. We'll go back to Russ, I think. Does that sound like a good idea? Got some more Camelina questions on. I think maybe let's start with this one on could you intercrop winter Camelina with winter cereals? People are thinking out of the box. It's great.
Oh, Um, yeah, that would be an intercrop. That wouldn't be a relay crop, growing the two together. Probably not going to work too well. I think probably both winter wheat and winter rye too, for that matter, would probably outcompete it. Partly because, like I said, in the fall, getting a lot of growth in the fall, it sits as a rosette during the fall. If you get early enough seeding on it and get some decent growth, it might compete okay, but I'm guessing it's probably going to be, I haven't tried it, so I don't know. Good idea. Let's give it a try. But I'm thinking that, I know winter rye for sure would probably outcompete it, and probably winter wheat would too. And even during the next spring, it'd be pretty tough. But, if you backed off your seeding rates on those, might be possible. What do you think, Marisol? You want to give that a try?
Okay. Well, we haven't tried it completely, but we have tried as a cover crop. Cover crop mixed with winter rye, and Abby has seen what happened, right? The camelina pretty much disappears under the rye, and so in the spring you can hardly find it. So the competition is a problem. The other thing is going to be a problem is matching the maturity. Camelina usually matures by the end of June, mid of July, and your winter wheat or winter rye is going to be later than that. So the problem is you're going to have to wait for the cereal, and by the time you wait for the cereal, a lot of the camelina seed is going to be gone. Even camelina doesn't chatter too much, but if you wait past the harvesting date 2 or 3 weeks, it might. So we haven't tried it, but I think it would be difficult to make it work for those 2 reasons.
Yeah, that's a good point. I forgot about the difference in life cycles too. The camelina is going to mature a lot sooner, but definitely that competition is going to be a big factor. And Marisol has shown that. She's done some of that work. So.
And Russ, staying on the topic of camelina here just for one more minute, and I never miss a chance to plug the Soil Sense podcast. So we did a camelina episode on the Soil Sense podcast in season 1 with Marisol. So check that out if you're interested. But we do have a question about how long you think it'll take to develop a market for this crop.
Well, I think it's really close. I mean, it depends on where you are in the United States. There have been growers out in the western part of the United States, mainly using spring camelina. But in Oregon, Washington, a little bit in Idaho, where they're catering to the biofuel market, and they have crushers out there that have been crushing it, and they're making biodiesel from it, and they might even be doing some jet fuel as well. Camelina oil tends to there's a process for making jet fuel from it that's really good as well. It makes a high quality jet fuel. And there's also, it doesn't grow as well down south, but there's also some biofuel refineries down there that it will take oil from oil seeds. Doesn't necessarily have to be camelina, it could be others, but they will take camelina. So if you're close to those places, yeah, you'd have a market, biofuel market. So the price for your seed probably obviously isn't going to be as high as if you're selling it for food uses. But I'm thinking seriously within the next 5 years, I think we're going to definitely see some expansion. There's some companies on the horizon. Another use for camelina oil that I forgot to mention is bioplastics, and that's huge right now. And there's a couple of companies working on it. One that's going to be working with us to do a pilot scale on-farm grow out next year, and they're using the oil to make plastics. And that's a smaller company, and so my hopes are, if they're successful, some of the bigger ones are going to glomp onto it. But there's a bigger company that's been working with us that's very interested. You probably heard of them, PepsiCo, and they're very interested in the bioplastics thing. So some of these other companies, if we're successful there, I think the markets will expand. And there again, that'd probably be a higher value market anyway than the biofuel market. But what I would like to see is to get it into some food uses as well. Like I said, the protein, actually it turns from some of the recent research that's been done, it turns out the protein may actually have more value than the oil. There's been some work done at the University of Minnesota that's showing, we talked about this morning, that purified camelina protein, camelina seed produces a lot of protein, has the same food functionality in a lot of cases for several food uses as soybean. So, there may be some good uses for the protein from the seed as well.
It's interesting. We have about 5 minutes left in your session, and it's been great. We've been getting a lot of excellent questions in the Q&A, and it sounds like you guys are answering questions in the chat as well as the Q&A. So maybe we'll take this opportunity, like we've done with other panels, to go around and give you guys a chance to say anything that we may have missed in our questioning that you want to make sure that people attending DIRT know. So let's start with Mike. Anything we missed?
Intercropping is really complicated. Okay, we're taking essentially a production system that's based on growing a single crop and growing a lot of a single crop, and so kind of what we're researching now is adding a layer of complexity to it that I think makes some people uncomfortable. And there's a lot of logistics that need to be figured out to make it work successfully. But for those people that are willing to go out and get it, there's some pretty big efficiency gains there that can be made. And I think that opens a lot of doors. There's some things with growing these systems that allow you then to reduce the risk of a crop failure of a single crop growing in a season. I think it opens the door for smaller growers. So for those people that have less acres, to make the land use more efficient. But there's definitely some barriers, and one of the biggest ones would be the post-harvest handling that's going to require that you don't necessarily always have to do with some of the other crops. So if we can get markets out there that will take mixed crops, which in some places those markets are developing, none really here in North Dakota right now, but I think once some of those markets might develop, then I think it's really going to blow the doors off this, and there'll be some real advantages to mixed cropping.
Let's go to Marisol and see if you've got any closing things that you want to say or things that we missed about.
I just want to say that, just like I said, all these systems that we're trying to find ways to increase diversity and improve soil health by using these different intercroppings. But if you want to try it, just don't try it in your whole farm. Just start small, start see what happens, how you're comfortable with the system. And before you go full, with these practices, it takes some time because, you have to adjust. And, I've been working 6 years with this system, and I know very little about it. We learn things every year, and we're trying the 60-inch corn with alfalfa now. And so we're trying different things and see what works. And also we're going to try to incorporate grazing. So if we can see grazing of this alfalfa corn in the fall after corn harvest. So there's so many options, but the point is that we want it to be profitable, not only good for the soil or the environment, but in the long run to be profitable for the farmer. But we're here to help you, but just don't get too excited yet. Just start small.
Let's go to Russ. Anything that we missed or that you want to make sure we know about relay cropping?
Yeah, well, I would just reiterate a little bit of what Marisol just said. As far as the relay cropping biz, I mean, unless you have a place to sell that camelina seed, don't go big yet. Okay, but the one thing I did want to add is I don't think farmers should be afraid to try it out and use it as a cover crop, even if they're not going to grow it out to maturity and harvest it. Because it does have, as we talked about before, it has some good cover crop benefits, ecosystem services that it provides. So I would say not to be afraid to mix it in your, as a cover crop and give it a try. Like I said, it's got excellent winter survival. And I've heard a lot of farmers say that they would like to have that broadleaf, which camelina is, it's a dicot option, as a winter hardy cover crop, along with having a grass like winter rye, of course, that's very winter hardy as well. gives you some other options, as far as weed control and things of that nature. One thing I did forget to mention, Abby, too, and that we've done some work on and actually published too, is that winter camelina, without the use of any herbicide, does a really good job of suppressing weeds and some of the herbicide resistant weeds that we see in our area. So I think that's an important addition to make too before I stop talking.
Absolutely. Thank you, Russ. That's a great addition. Thank you, Russ and Mike and Marisol, for giving us some of those new ideas to take forward and things to think about for the next year.